Last week, the Federal Reserve opened up its swap lines to the Swiss National Bank to the tune of over $6 billion. This $6.3 billion draw comes on the backs of about $3 billion just 1 week earlier. To put this in context, this is more than the Swiss National Bank drew from the Fed swap lines during 2020. So number one, what are these swap lines? How do they work? And number two, why in the world does the Swiss National Bank need $9 billion right now? Ready? Let's dive in. Real quick, I've just released my brand new bear market investing guide because money is made during bull markets, but fortunes are made during bear markets because you get to buy world-class assets when there's blood in the streets at huge value prices. So in this course, I teach you how to identify bear markets and when they're turning, number one. And then number two, looking at what the companies are that are the best assets. And then number three, how to determine what price you should be buying those assets at. This course normally costs $300, but right now only I've got it for $99. The discount link is in the description below. All right, take a look at this. On October 13th, the Swiss National Bank had drawn $6.3 billion from the Fed's swap line. The week before that, they had drawn $3.1 billion. And these two transactions were larger than anything they did during 2020. Now, you might say, hey, well, times are tough right now. Yields are going crazy. Currencies are changing like crazy. This is a tough time. Maybe everybody's doing this. Well, no, nobody else is except for the ECB. The European Central Bank was the only other central bank doing a swap trade, and it only drew $211 million. Now, you might be adding up $3 billion plus $6 billion and looking at $9 billion. And while that is an aggregate total, we have to keep in mind that these are 7-day terms. So now we have to take a step back, and you're probably thinking, well, what in the world are these swap lines and how can I get my hands on one? And unfortunately, you can't. This is for central banks only. Swap lines are arrangements between central banks to make sure currency is available for their member banks. So we've got the Swiss National Bank over here and the Federal Reserve over here. Swiss National Bank goes to the Fed and says, hey, we need a few billion US dollars. So they look at the exchange rate at the time, they come up with a small interest fee, and they say, okay, I'm going to give you Swiss francs, the same amount needed to get $3 billion in US dollars from you, and 7 days later, we'll swap back. That's why it's called a swap line. Biggest pawn shop in the world. Now, the reason why these swap lines are available is so that central banks don't have to go out into the open market to do this. Because with the US dollar index being at multi-decade highs, quickly needing to access a large amount of currency could move the markets like crazy and make that price, that exchange rate, much worse. It'd be like the difference between you needing to get a bunch of used iPhones, so you have to go to eBay, you have to buy up all the used iPhones that are for sale, and then you have to put an open listing and say, I will buy any iPhones from anybody. They kind of get to determine that price there since you've bought them up from everybody, just basic supply and demand. The price of used iPhones would skyrocket. Versus if you instead just go to Apple and say, hey, I need, a couple thousand iPhones, buy them directly from the source. They might be able to come up with an agreement with you instead of you having to go buy them out from the open market. Same thing going on here. Instead of moving the price, moving the market, just go directly to the source and they say, hey, I need dollars for 7 days. Give me the dollars at a predetermined price, and in 7 days we'll swap them back. Except this time, 7 days later, when they swapped them back, they said, okay, now instead of $3 billion, this week we need another $6 billion. Now, you're probably still wondering, well, what do they need this money for? Nobody's accessing swap lines right now, so what in the world could the Swiss National Bank need billions and billions of US dollars for at this moment? Well, the reason why these swap lines exist is so that the currency can then be made available for the member banks. The Fed is kind of like the central bank to the other central banks around the world. A central bank is simply a bank for banks. So the Fed operates as a bank for all the central banks. Then the central banks operate as banks for the banks in their country. So this would indicate that there must be a bank in Switzerland that has drastic need for some quick US dollars. Has there been a Swiss bank in trouble recently? I'm racking my brain trying to think of this, but I can't seem to think of any Swiss bank that's been accused of things like conspiracy network, or Swiss banks that have gotten hit with a tax probe, or Swiss banks that are in so much trouble that their CEO has to issue a letter saying how good of a position they're in. So yes, the pawn shop system of exchanging currencies and central banks printing money for each other is there to rescue their member banks when their member banks get in trouble. Because it'd just be a shame if a bank who participated in some potentially fraudulent services, who ran up a bunch of risk and profited on it, and then it turned out they took on too much risk and risked failure, it'd be a shame if we actually let those institutions fail and bear the consequences of their own actions. No, instead, we want moral hazard around. We want to make sure that these banks continue to do that. So we give them a big safety net so that if they ever get too risky and approach failure, we know that they are absolutely certain that they're safe. Oh, and by the way, the IRS announced they're hiring 87,000 new agents to make sure that we're auditing the rich. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.